Hi all, so today we talk about medieval university and especially about the organization of the universitary phenomenon directed by the secular and ecclesiastical powers once that they had actually reached a certain level of development. But we have to flash a little back at least, not on the very origins of the university that will substantially need a dedicated video, but rather on how they were formed and why during the Low Middle Ages. Now, as we know, the universitary phenomenon was born in the 12th century. The first university of Europe was the one of Bologna in northern Italy, and was closely followed by the one of Paris, and they made the most important universities, even though they were different in a way. We don't have to explain why, but it's pretty much obvious. Bologna was normally a more secular environment in many ways. People went there to learn law. Most of all, Paris was instead more of a theological center. People went there to perfect their knowledge of Christianism, etc. But the important is that the universitary phenomenon at a certain point begins to spread, even numerically speaking. So students and teachers began to increase numerically, dramatically, because there was that happening parallel with the actual need for learning and knowledge, which was a very practical need in the sense that university had been born spontaneously by people who wanted to know because they needed that knowledge in order to exercise a profession. So the university phenomenon, as we know it from the late Middle Ages onwards, is something that actually um, um, arrived at the term of a process of progressive framing and eventual crystallization of the university phenomenon. Initially speaking, it was something very free, and we have to bear that in mind. And this spontaneity actually was present in many of association was present in many other branches, basically all the branches of community life during the Low Middle Ages at that time. So the universities began to organize themselves just spontaneously, and just like all the other corporations existing at that time, mostly professional, um, and they were even called essentially by the same name, because today we call university the actual academic institution in which people go teaching and learning. But the term universitas in Latin, which is the one that actually means university, was generically used in the Middle Ages to describe every kind of organized community. This can be evidently understood by the same etymology of the word. Universitas comes from universus, that is the same like in English universes, which literally means turned towards a single direction. So it was, communitarily speaking, was perceived as something that basically had one common aim, and it stressed even first of all, the comprehensive nature of these groups, and also, however, the various, um, you know, um, parts of this group. So the various people who coming from different backgrounds, however, still had a common interest. So something that would make them proceed together towards a certain aim. So it's basically impossible to spot with certainty when universities actually gave themselves a definite physiognomy, because we basically lack sources in many ways. So the spontaneity of this phenomenon eventually brought to to a more structured organization that left written documents, statutes and stuff like that, just like the other corporations. But we're pretty much at the obscure of what the original phenomenon actually looked like. We know that in Bologna, this evolution happened between the 13th century. So there was basically a constitution of universitas, of students, that or better universitates, because there were more than one, that were organized on the base of their origin, geographical origin. This was very important because people obviously spoke Latin at that time, but they had different different origins, and even this myth that people understood each other because they spoke Latin, even at this stage of low medieval history, is false in many ways. It was still pretty much difficult to understand each other, and the first universities actually came together because because the people who made it up spoke the same language. So these groups, in fact, were called nationes in Latin, roughly translatable as nations, even though it's a bit of more of a different meaning from the contemporary one. And in the 13th century, they organized in turn into two major associations that were one for the Transalpine students, so students coming broadly from Central and Northern Europe, that was called Universitas Scholarium Ultramontanorum. That means literally, the universities of the Transalpine students, and one for the Italians, the Universitas Citramontanorum. So the university of those who were from let's say this side of the Alps. So every university was guided by a rector that was elected among the students. This is also very interesting because it tells you, how democratic in many ways these organizations practically were. Every university therefore elected one of these rectors, and his task was the one of fixing the remunerations for the professors, the plans of studies, as long with the prices for the the stay in the cities. That was also very important at that point, the accommodation, the lodging, that also made a lot of money. So it was very important in these cities, the university cities, what kind of of price the students would actually come to pay for in the city, because for the city it was extremely important from an economical point of view. And also the price of the books. Books at this age, although not so much uncommon like in the early Middle Ages, began to be more widespread, but they still costed pretty much, because they had to be created by essentially the skin of animals. That was extremely costly. From a single sheep you could obtain a very few actual manuscript pages. So you can imagine how the manuscript was something extremely valuable also in terms of material wealth. And this happened obviously because of the technology of the time, so that even for for the students, providing themselves books was something to be done in an organized fashion. Was a lot of economy gravitating around it, and it basically functioned often through a form of copying that was done basically renting single parts of the books, really like a bit like students still do today with copies, photocopies, and stuff like that. And in Paris, instead, there was an association of teachers of the citizen schools that had a common name, that was the one of stemming the ingerence of the local councillor and bishop, from whom depended the ecclesiastical schools, into the programs and the methods of teaching. And in this sense, the masters, before the end of the 12th century, managed to detach from the cathedral school, and to gain some degree of autonomy by articulating their teaching in four faculties, that is arts, canonic right, medicine, and theology. So even very important subjects that actually show one very important character in the development of a university phenomenon, that was essentially we recalled it, that is essentially the spontaneity of this phenomenon, but through which we can understand how much culture was being spread outside of the usual sources of knowledge, that was in this sense the cathedral school, as we've seen in Paris, and that were meant that there were increasingly more laymen that wanted to gain knowledge on their own, and to study it without the control of certain authorities that had obviously a power over them, and checked essentially what they wanted to what they had to learn or not. And the example of Bologna and Paris was basically imitated all over Europe. And Bologna, alongside the with the schools of canonic and civil right, became essentially the model for the university organization all over Italy, Spain, and southern France. So broadly speaking, southern Europe. Instead, in Paris was the reference point for the University of Northern Europe, and first of all Oxford, eventually Cambridge. And these models were so much followed, and the university phenomenon so widespread, that at the end of the 15th century, Europe counted around 80 universities. Now, popes, sovereigns, and communes basically immediately understood the importance of these new institutions, and they attempted to gain the control over them, because that obviously meant not just an ideological control, but also obviously the first of all, a great deal of, for instance, of people who could study under them by essentially developing and prompting their own ideological position. But also, and especially probably, the economical profits that derived from controlling the single universities. Now, you have to think in a world in which, like medieval Europe, when there wasn't, a very strong centralized authority in spite of the universal powers and local kingdoms and feudal system, finding a pattern to, develop your own, your own interests, and therefore being, getting something in exchange for your services was something very, very important. And at the same time, it was also a way to lose part of the freedom that, originally speaking, the university had. So with the new threats and the concession of privileges, was essentially an all one thing, so something that kind of check and balance the same phenomenon, and eventually brought the universities to had the same the same heading towards progressive control of the same phenomenon. And in 1258, Frederick I began with the so-called Constitutio Habita, um, which was emanated, here we see, by Frederick I Barbarossa, so the Holy Roman Emperor, the major secular authority all over the at least Western Christendom, at least reputed as such, that was granted to the students of Bologna. We don't know whether by request, because it was a sort of interaction. Now, the political situation was quite complicated. There were people in Europe at the time, in Italy at the time, that Frederick is a sort of of savior from the expansion of certain aggressive communes. Other communes obviously instead saw him as a tyrant and wanted to impose his own rule over them. So there was a bit of a factionalism over which Frederick played by entering into the university, and Bologna was the most important one, and especially was the most important law university at the time existing. So since what he wanted to do was getting the his power over the over Italy, he was obviously stressing. Excuse me, one second. You probably heard some noise. I'm sorry about that. Extremely. It's just that over me there is some noise. I can't figure out what it is. Now it should be stopped. I'm sorry for. I will come back immediately on what I was talking about. So we're talking about Frederick I Barbarossa and his Constitutio Habita. What did he do through this constitution was to grant the students of the University of Bologna the privilege not to be judged by the local commune tribunals, but rather the ones of the bishop and or the one of their masters at a choice. Now, this is an extremely important privilege for the students that, first of all, was considered by the Holy Roman Emperor. So the highest figure they could imagine, and that still at that age had an important factual power into Europe, so a force to be reckoned with even in matters of politics and law. So having this privilege in the juridical world of the low Middle Ages really meant a lot, because it was something that could be waived, like, here we have the emperor's privilege, so we are like the best guys around. And the reason why Frederick did that, which I was trying to explain before our interruption, was to essentially protect, obviously, this community and to draw valuable human resources from it. He needed jurists to carry out his own imperial policy that was in that sense backed very strongly by the revival of Roman law, for the simple fact that at that time the emperors were trying to stress the fact that their legal prerogatives, that was the one of even making law at a certain point, or at least intervening and judging into the various the local rights affairs, was substantially independent from the Pope's intervention, and the Roman law, which was essentially the code of Theodosius, eventually completed and broadened by Justinian back in the late antique period, was the one of absolute emperors, because at that time the Roman the Eastern Roman Empire didn't have, a religious authority telling the emperor what to do, like instead was happening in the West at that point. So it was extremely important to get a privilege like that, because it meant that the city, the commune of Bologna itself, couldn't intervene in judging the matters of these people. Um, Extremely important. They could, the students could be judged by the bishop if they wanted, or even better, because that granted a much higher autonomy, by their own masters. So by these figures that, by those standards, were definitely of the same substance, let's say, of the students, as we have seen. Well, initially speaking, these studia, as the universities were called proper at that time, were highly egalitarian originally, then eventually, and probably even at this time, they were progressively going towards a stratification, as we were saying. And the and this event, this concession by Frederick, is extremely important, because it kind of marks the first intervention of a public authority into the regulation of university affairs. Even the popes began to intervene repeatedly, especially from the 13th century, with particular concessions in favor of Bologna and Paris, that were conceived, in fact, at this point as the still as the leading studia in Europe, and that therefore, as we said before, were setting essentially the pattern of what a university had to be like. Then there is also the grandson of Frederick I, Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, that opened a new path in the relations between the universities and the political institutions, by taking an initiative that would have served as a model for other sovereigns as well. Basically, in 1224, in order to avoid his subjects of the Kingdom of Sicily to go studying out of the Sicilian boundaries, meant as one of the reign, not just of the island geographically meant, he founded into Naples, in fact, in southern peninsular Italy, the Studium of Naples, that is the University of Naples still today, that was destined to form the functionaries of the kingdom. Which was very important, because here it was, not just, exploiting, it was not exploiting a pre-existing university like it happened at the time of Frederick I. Here it was a king basically creating and founding a university on its own that had essentially a national function. And there were a lot of conditions. Excuse me, I have to drink a little. Ah, yeah, that's better. Sorry, but this is the good of, I can't say a live, but a long audio recording. You need to drink sometimes. Um, I was saying that the foundation of the University of Naples also saw the setting of certain other, all the problems that we mentioned before, regarding, for instance, the prices of the rents for the students' accommodations that couldn't go up a certain price. certain financing to the studies and other facilitations, um, and um, and and the University of Naples, in this sense, was the first one that began not for the initiative of local masters and students, but by the one of a sovereign and with a formal act of foundation. Now, this set, obviously, a pattern was very widely exploited all over Europe. I'm thinking, for instance, at the University of Prague, that kind of became the center of Europe. I also made a in the 14th century, also made a video about 14th century Bohemia that talks about that. Well, Charles IV founded the University of Prague, one of the most famous in Europe, even today, and that was done explicitly to pursue a national policy, and to obviously furnish the kingdom with trained scholars and attracting, the intelligentsia of Europe at that time. One of the consequences was also that foreign students arrived. Prague, for instance, in 14th century acquired many German, French, Italian students, because a good place to study was also priced, just like today, probably better at that time, because today it's a bit all fake. The statistics are all a bit based on maybe on how much the university fares economically, but not really the quality of the studying. In the Middle Ages, instead, the quality of a university was really very much felt. Also, because there wasn't much of a standardization at this point, so even there were administrative experimentations that made a great deal of difference, and that could eventually qualify the university in itself. Then, concluding, I would like to mention instead a very different case, a sort of an exception in in the landscape of medieval education. That is the one of the medical school of Salerno, mm, in southern Italy. Because sometimes you hear, Salerno was this first university. I'm not much of an expert, but I'm prone to think it wasn't really a university like all the others. Probably later it had some importance acquired, but it's more of sort of a very fascinating exception in this landscape. Some people say it's the first university of medieval Europe. I don't think this is correct, even though it truly is one of the most ancient school centers of a certain level of education in medieval Europe. Was extremely prized, by the way, as such. And in fact, we don't say the University of Salerno, but the Medical School of Salerno, which also stresses, by the way, the sometimes say the mix of theoretical and practical knowledge that medicine required, obviously already for the knowledge of the time. The medical school of Salerno wasn't born out of the free associations of students and professors, but it basically was born as an assistential structure, like the majority of hospitals and medical centers had existed essentially from the ancient world onwards. Essentially, these were places, kind of recoveries for pilgrims, for people coming a bit from everywhere. It was originally directed by monks, if I'm not wrong, or at least by people who had began with an older form of a pre-university form of education. So something even quite experimental in strictly scientific terms for that time, even though not so unusual, considering previous experiments all over, the ancient world. And basically, the fame of Salernitan manics was so widespread that it was a very famous center already in 10th century Europe. However, in order to have the first witnesses of the existence of an actual um, teaching organization, we have to wait those numerous treatises of medicine, therapeutics, and I don't know how to say that. I think the right term is herbal medicine. I would call it in another way in my mother tongue, but I believe this is the correct translation. Um, um, and that were began to be produced also here, and it's not a coincidence, probably in the 12th century. So in the same century in which elsewhere the university phenomenon was instead was spreading. And basically we have the indirect witness of an activity that was aimed at the preparation of the students of medicine, in which the learning of Greek and Arab medicine was basically accompanied by a very intense, an equally intense, work of translation from Greek and Arab, the scientific treatises, and especially the ones of Aristotle. So I will surely talk more in detail about the medical school of Salerno, but I think it was worth to mention in a chapter about medieval universities, because it's strictly related with with an element that really triggered in many ways the birth of universities themselves, even though Salerno wasn't one properly. That is the circulation of books, of manuscripts, of knowledge that, as in this case we see, was mostly a knowledge coming from elsewhere, from Western, relatively from Western Europe. We mostly see these Greek and Arab manuscripts that were Greek and Arab because they were essentially containing the knowledge of Hellenistic science that the Byzantines and the Arab world were keeping on their own, and that in Western Europe had gone forgotten for some time, essentially because people couldn't read, and society was still backwards in some ways. The Byzantine Empire and the Islamic Caliphate had seen the peak of early medieval culture in many ways. They had these huge libraries, they had scholars from local courts to go studying in these libraries, and although it's a very different model of education from Western Europe, it's important to note how it was essentially in continuity with the one of the ancient world, and it was a mostly elitistic form of education that was also quite often almost entirely theoretical, um, or at least this also depends on the actual scientific knowledge of the time, in the sense that the medical knowledge at that time compared to ours is obviously very low, very poor, extremely poor, um, and let's say that the medieval mind was more attracted by a sort of encyclopedical form of knowledge that basically aimed at interpreting the whole world as a divine creation, and therefore it wasn't much more important at that point to practice, but rather to read, to learn, and to make a sort of philological research by, in this case, what the Arabs did in translating Aristotle, sometimes also adding obviously other knowledge together with the one of these authorities, so that for instance the Aristotle that comes into the West through the Arab manuscripts is not really Aristotle proper. It's a transformation of other that passed through Arab culture, and that even enriched and characterized in a certain way Aristotelism in a very peculiar way. But what is important is that um, um, the European universities were born in a much different way. They weren't born from the top, from courts, or from a very restricted number of intellectuals, like maybe even in the Renaissance it would have happened. But from the 12th century, Europeans basically started from the bottom. I mean, it was common people belonging to the middle class um, that wanted to acquire knowledge and using it for practical purposes. So, for instance, the Salerno's medical school was also a place where there was also very strong practice in medicine, which is not to be given for granted, because obviously, yeah, medicine has to be applied at a certain point. But it's important to see how, in many ways, Western Europe actually um, re um, behaved in much more different ways from the rest of the world, and especially had this base of commoners that made the greatest progress in this field. And you can see that continuously. The East, the Byzantine world, the Arab world, from the 12th century onwards remains not really behind, but in a certain sense, it has less resources. And you can see how the 12th century, as the century of universities that we often think as a very theoretical thing, even in today's world, actually is accompanied by a steady progress in all the other branches. Think about naval engineering, other forms of technology, military technology, etc. That altogether really show how Europe was incredibly on the rise, and through knowledge that was mainly practical, and that the Europeans felt the need at that time to associate also with the theoretical one that had been treasured in the East, and that now they were capable of starting to read and to know. And one of these paradoxes is also that the Europeans at a certain point already, but not just them, is that this knowledge actually came in the hands of people who had already made almost all the work by themselves already without reading books. I mean, think about siege warfare. People say, yeah, at that time in which trebuchet in the 12th century started appearing, there are also treatises and manuscripts describing how trebuchets worked and could be built, and about ancient siege machines from the classical knowledge, etc. But what we forget is not that these people used that as a manual, but they used that as a sort of complement to a know-how that they had already acquired, and that they just tried to perfect. The same happened in the Renaissance. The Renaissance wasn't triggered by the appropriation of Hellenistic knowledge from the East, from the fleeing Byzantine refugees during the Ottoman advance and stuff like that. It was the Renaissance culture that was already ready to ask for for that knowledge in order to integrate it in the one that was already formed. And I think that this is a very important point to make, especially in the light of modern technology. The idea that um, we have a lot of prejudices as moderns towards technology by thinking that basically with a guide, with a manual, you can make an operation and then you can create something new. But really, the steady technological progress into which we still live is actually deriving from a very practical knowledge most of the times. While the theoretical is most of the times just a reflection of it or a rationalization of it. But it's not the first aspect. So once again, I say sorry. I ask for your pardon for the noise before and for the fact that I had to interrupt. I don't know what's going on with these noises up here, but I hope that we won't have this problem in the future. At least now we were capable of making a good talk. Um, um, I thank you very much for listening. As always, if you like this video, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel for further for receiving further content that I will hopefully keep doing. And as always, I express my thankfulness for anyone towards anyone who listens to me. I hope you enjoy my contents. I really don't know how they sound, how they don't. I'm not really doing much well in terms of analytics of views, but I see that there is some kind of interest widespread, at least towards the topics I try to talk about. So I hope obviously not to let you down, to be to be enough satisfactory for your curiosities, and always know that I really want to talk about the Middle Ages now in depth. So I will probably move to other topics sometimes, but for now I want to create this base by talking as much as possible about Middle Ages to form a base of videos that eventually will show me, quantitatively how much it is convenient to continue. So if you are interested about it, the best thing you can do is supporting me in some way. If this is obvious, if you want something, you have to make some offer. Um, so, well, I thank you once again for listening. As always, I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.